Why did no one else move? Why did the most elite warriors on Earth stand frozen at the edge of that barren valley, while all eyes fell on her? Brooklyn Hayes adjusted the strap of her helmet. The weight pressed differently now, heavier, as if it carried more than Kevlar, carried the expectation of every silent glance in the room. She wasn't supposed to speak. Not here. Not in front of officers, commanders, men and women twice her experience. But silence felt heavier than the storm outside. The briefing table buzzed with tension. A six-man patrol Bravo team was missing. No comms, no signals, no sign of life. The storm was closing in, snow sweeping across the Afghan mountains like a white wall of secrecy. If they weren't found soon, they wouldn't be found at all. Brooklyn listened. Her fellow soldiers debated terrain maps, weather reports, and probabilities that sounded more like eulogies. She knew those numbers didn't matter. She knew the men out there didn't have probabilities, they had hours, maybe less. Her stomach knotted. She remembered her father's voice, years ago under a northern Alaskan sky that stretched endless and cruel. The land will provide everything you need, but only if you learn to listen. Don't fight it, read it. She could read this land. Not Afghanistan specifically, no, but mountains, storms, the desperation of men trying to stay alive in the wilderness. That was her mother tongue. She could almost see their tracks before the maps even tried to show them. But to say that out loud, to tell hardened commanders that she, the quiet girl from Alaska no one paid attention to, might succeed where doctrine failed, that was insanity. Yet when silence fell across the table, when the colonel's words landed like stones, "We have 12 hours before this search becomes impossible," Brooklyn heard herself speak. "Ma'am, I might know how to find them." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Heads turned, some eyes narrowed, some rolled. A few smirked the way soldiers smirk at the one who speaks out of turn. Brooklyn kept her face still. She'd learned stillness as a girl, crouched by rivers for hours, waiting for the flash of silver under ice. Stillness was her armor. The colonel frowned. "Hayes, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." "You think you can do what trained teams?" Brooklyn's throat tightened. But her father's lessons, her mother's quiet resilience, the endless winters, all of it steadied her spine. "I think I can cover more ground alone than teams can together. I can read the signs of movement in this terrain. If they're alive, I can find them." A silence sharper than the storm itself followed. No one laughed now, not because they believed her, but because the sheer audacity unsettled them. The colonel leaned back, arms crossed, studying this unremarkable soldier who rarely spoke, who rarely drew notice. "You're proposing a solo search, in hostile territory, in a blizzard." Brooklyn nodded once, not bravado, not pride, just truth. Her squad leader shifted uncomfortably, caught between doubt and the recognition that maybe, just maybe, this girl carried something they couldn't measure. The colonel's voice lowered. "If I send you and you fail, you understand what that means." Brooklyn thought of the 6 men out there, freezing, injured, alone. She thought of her own winters, of the time she had fallen through ice at 12 years old and clawed her way out while her lungs burned like fire. She had survived because she knew she must, because nobody else was coming. Her voice was steady. "I understand, ma'am." The decision was made faster than anyone expected. Maybe because the clock was already bleeding away. Maybe because the colonel saw something unshakable in her pale blue eyes. 2 hours later, Brooklyn stood at the edge of the storm, gear strapped tight, helicopter blades thrumming against the mountains. The other soldiers watched her, some whispering wagers, some shaking their heads. But no one stepped forward to take her place. When the helicopter dropped her into the white wilderness, the world swallowed her whole. The storm bit her face, snow clawed at her boots, wind screamed like it wanted her gone. She knelt, pressed a gloved hand to the frozen earth, and felt an old calm wash over her. "This is where I belong." She moved like a shadow into the mountains. No radio chatter, No squad to anchor her, just instinct, memory, and the faint, fragile belief that 6 lives flickered out there, waiting for her to keep them burning. The storm deepened. Hours bled away. Tracks blurred into nothing. But where others would see chaos, Brooklyn read patterns. The snow carried stories. The uneven scuff of boots, the drag of a wounded leg, the broken rhythm of men stumbling against the storm. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't following just tracks. She was following fear, exhaustion, survival itself. And every sign pulled her deeper into the white maze. Then a break, a rock formation shielding the wind. Faint voices carried ragged on the air. Brooklyn froze, her breath caught. She had found them, or some of them. Her boots crunched toward the shelter, each step weighted with dread and hope. What she saw carved itself into her memory forever. 4 men, half buried in makeshift cover, faces pale with cold, one bleeding badly. Their eyes widened at her figure emerging from the storm, relief, disbelief, and a flicker of life returning. "Hayes," one rasped, his voice cracked between gratitude and astonishment. "How the hell?" Brooklyn dropped beside them, already pulling supplies from her pack. "No time. Where are the others?" Their leader's jaw clenched. His voice broke. "Separated 2 more out there. We couldn't hold together." The storm howled louder, as if reminding her of the clock. 6 soldiers. She had 4. 2 still scattered in a wilderness that killed without mercy. Brooklyn swallowed hard, meeting their eyes, seeing fear give way to fragile hope. She steadied her breath, her hands, her voice. "I'll find them." And for the first time, the men believed her. How could she walk away? How could she leave 4 injured soldiers huddled in a fragile shelter, just to vanish again into a storm that might never give her back? Brooklyn's breath came in steady clouds, her heart beating louder than the wind. She looked at their faces, eyes sunken, skin raw with cold, hope barely clinging. They had found salvation in her arrival. Now she was telling them she would disappear again. But she knew what her father would said. Saving half a life isn't saving a life at all. You finish what you start. She pulled more rations from her pack, pressed them into their hands, adjusted the tarp over their shelter, added branches to insulate against the cold. Every small motion was deliberate, efficient. They needed to see calm in her face, even if the storm outside screamed otherwise. "I'll be back," she said. The words were simple, but her voice carried weight. Not promise, not bravado, just certainty. Staff Sergeant Torres, their leader, tried to rise, but the pain bent him back down. His lips trembled with cold. "Hayes, if you go out there alone, you may not." She cut him off gently, a hand resting on his shoulder. "If I don't, they won't." Their eyes locked. He saw something in her then, not arrogance, not recklessness, but an unshakable will that reminded him of why soldiers follow certain leaders without question. Finally he nodded, "Bring them home." Brooklyn adjusted her rifle, checked the rope coiled at her side, and stepped back into the white abyss. The wind swallowed her instantly. Their voices were gone. The world was only storm, stone, and the faint ghost of tracks she prayed were not yet erased. Every step was a gamble. The snow shifted, hiding drops that could swallow a person whole. The wind clawed at her balance, screaming as if to drive her back. Her compass was nearly useless. The storm twisted directions, made east and west feel interchangeable. But Brooklyn didn't need a compass. She read the land. The contours under her boots, the way the wind curled against ridges, the subtle lines of snow where boots had dragged. 2 soldiers, somewhere close, somewhere slipping toward death. She moved through a narrow pass, her breath slowing, her ears straining for sound. And then faint, barely audible, a voice, a broken cry carried on the storm. Brooklyn froze, her pulse racing. She crouched low, scanning the terrain. The sound came again, weaker this time. To her left, the ground dropped into a ravine. She slid down the slope, boots digging in, snow tearing past her legs. Her flashlight cut through the haze, beam quivering. And there, shapes. Two men huddled at the base of the ravine, one slumped against the other. She stumbled toward them, heart surging. Private Specialist Davis, alive barely. His face was pale, lips blue. His leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. Davis shivered violently, his teeth chattering, eyes glazed with the telltale signs of hypothermia. Brooklyn dropped beside them, her hands already moving. She pulled blankets, tore open heat packs, pressed water to lips that barely swallowed. She forced her calm into their fear, her strength into their failing bodies. "You're not dying here," she whispered, voice low, steady, the same tone her father once used to steady her after she'd fallen through river ice. "Not while I'm here." Groaned, clutching his leg. We couldn't climb, thought we were done." Brooklyn glanced up. The ravine walls were jagged, slick with snow. No way the injured could scale them, but leaving them here, impossible. The storm would bury them alive by morning. She studied the slope, mind racing. Rope, harness improvisation, mechanical advantage. She had done this before in Alaska, pulling deer out of crevasses, rescuing herself when cliffs crumbled beneath her boots. The mountain hadn't changed, only the stakes had. "You're coming up with me," she told them. Davis shook his head weakly. "Too steep, too cold." Her tone sharpened, cutting through his despair. "No, you don't get to give up, not today." It took hours. Hours of cold biting her fingers raw, muscles screaming as she anchored the rope, tied improvised harnesses, braced herself against stone to lift men heavier than her small frame should ever have moved. Each pull felt impossible. Each breath tore at her lungs. Snow stung her face, wind howled, rope burned. But inch by inch they rose. First Davis, shivering and weak, hauled onto the ledge, wrapped in her remaining insulation. Then his legs screaming agony, his weight nearly dragging her back into the ravine. Her arms shook violently, tears freezing against her lashes, but she refused to let go. With a final scream of effort, she pulled him over the edge. They collapsed together in the snow, gasping. For a moment, Brooklyn allowed herself to lie there, her body trembling, her chest heaving. But the storm roared above her, and the memory of 4 waiting soldiers sharpened her mind. This wasn't victory. Not yet. She built an improvised travois from branches, straps, and rope, something she could drag across the snow. She secured first, then Davis, checked their wraps, forced them to drink more water. "Stay awake," she ordered, voice sharp but laced with quiet care. "Keep talking to me. Tell me anything. Home, family, doesn't matter, just talk." Their voices were weak, fragmented, but they obeyed. Fragments of childhood, girlfriends, places they missed spilled into the storm. Brooklyn listened, encouraged, answered with her own small pieces of memory. Alaska rivers, the silence of snow, a father who taught her that life and death often depended on patience. The travois dragged behind her as she pulled, step after agonizing step, toward where she'd left the others. The slope fought her. The snow resisted. Her muscles ached like fire. But the voices behind her, thin, fragile, human, drove her forward. Hours later, she saw the faint glow of the shelter. Relief swelled in her chest as Tors and the others struggled to their feet, staggering forward to help her pull the injured the last few yards. They collapsed together inside the crude walls. 6 men now. 6 lives gathered around the single soldier who had refused to accept the impossible. Tors looked at her, his voice ragged with awe. "Hayes, you brought them back." Brooklyn met his gaze, breath still shuddering. Snow clung to her hair, her lashes, her uniform. She was shaking, drained, half frozen, but her voice was steady, simple. "They weren't mine to leave behind." The storm howled outside, merciless. But inside that fragile shelter, 6 men believed in survival again. Because one quiet soldier from Alaska had walked into the impossible and returned with what was lost. And yet the hardest part was still to come. They weren't out, not yet. How do you move 6 broken men through a mountain that doesn't want you alive? Brooklyn crouched inside the narrow shelter, her hands pressed against the cold earth, her mind racing. The storm outside had not eased, it had worsened. The wind hammered the rock like artillery. Snow piled higher against the entrance, threatening to bury them inside. The 6 soldiers stared at her in silence, their eyes holding the unspoken truth. Without her, they were finished. Their strength was gone, their supplies nearly spent, their hope hung by a thread. Brooklyn chewed the inside of her cheek, remembering nights in Alaska when the temperature dropped so low the stars themselves seemed brittle. She remembered her father's voice. When the storm says stop, you listen. But listening doesn't mean surrendering. It means planning. She looked at Tor's. We can't stay here, not another night. Tor's face was drawn, lips cracked, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Moving in this storm is suicide. Her gaze didn't waver. Staying is slower suicide. The words landed heavy. She knew how they sounded, harsh, cold, but truth was often cruel. She had no room for comfort. She spread the map across the floor, her gloved hand tracing in valleys. Here, 2 clicks west, flat enough for road or wash. It's the only chance for a bird to touch down. If the weather breaks, even briefly, that's where we'll get pulled out. 2 kilometers, Davis rasped. His lips were blue, his body wrapped in layers that still couldn't stop the tremors. In this. Brooklyn met his eyes. Yes, and I'll get you there. Silence followed. Not agreement, not belief. Just silence. The space where men weighed life against death and chose to follow because no other option remained. At dawn, or what passed for dawn in a storm that blotted out the sun, Brooklyn led them into the white void. The travois groaned under the weight of, his legs splinted crudely with branches. Davis stumbled beside him, leaning on Brooklyn's shoulder when his legs buckled. Tor's and the other 3 staggered behind, carrying what little gear remained. The wind was merciless. It clawed their faces, froze their breath into crystals that clung to eyelashes and beards. Visibility dropped to feet at times, just the faint shadow of the soldier ahead, a ghost in the storm. Brooklyn marched at the front, head bowed, every step calculated. She read the terrain through touch and instinct. She felt the way snow shifted under her boots, the subtle slopes that suggested a path rather than a trap. Where others saw only white, she saw direction. Her body ached, her lungs burned, but her voice cut through the storm, steady and sharp. 1 step at a time, that's all you owe me. 1 step. Hours bled away. Time lost meaning. The storm was an endless wall, pressing, testing, daring them to surrender. When one man fell, Brooklyn lifted him. When another muttered about stopping, she knelt eye to eye, her voice low, fierce. You stop, you die. Not here. Not with me. At one point, Tor's collapsed face first into the snow. For a moment, Brooklyn feared he wouldn't rise. She knelt beside him, her hand gripping his collar, her voice shaking. Sergeant, look at me. His eyes fluttered open, clouded, unfocused. She shook him once hard. Your men are watching. If you quit, they quit. Get up. Something in her tone, equal parts command and plea, pulled him back. He pushed to his knees, then his feet. Slowly, painfully, he moved forward again. They reached the ridge she had marked. The plateau stretched ahead, flat enough barely for a helicopter to land if the sky would open. But the storm was still relentless, visibility near zero. They dug in, creating a low wall of snow and rock, carving a pocket of shelter to wait. Brooklyn pulled her radio, the one piece of tech she trusted in spite of the storm. She keyed it, her voice clipped. Granite, this is Hayes. 6 survivors located, at designated extraction point. Need bird when window clears. Static, nothing. Her gut clenched. She tried again, adjusting frequency, shielding the radio with her body. Granite, copy. The reply came broken, distorted. Copy, storm, window, standby. It was enough. Hope flickered in the men's eyes. But waiting was its own battle. The hours dragged. The cold seeped deeper. Men drifted toward sleep, the dangerous slide into hypothermia. Brooklyn forced them awake, making them talk, making them eat tiny bites of ration, making them drink snow melted over her small stove. She shared stories, not heroic ones, but simple ones. The way Alaskan rivers froze with a sound like breaking glass. The taste of dried fish her father packed in old tins. The silence of night so still you could hear wolves breathe. The soldiers listened, clinging to the rhythm of her voice. It gave them something to anchor against the storm. Then suddenly silence. Not inside the shelter, outside. The wind eased just slightly, enough that Brooklyn's head snapped up, her ears strained. And then she heard it, a faint thrum, a vibration in the air. Helicopter. The men stirred, disbelief in their eyes. Brooklyn grabbed the flare, scrambled to the edge of the plateau and fired. A red streak cut the gray sky, bright against the storm's fatting edge. Moments later, the black shape of a helicopter loomed through the haze, wobbling against the wind, fighting to hold position. Snow blasted in every direction as it descended, rotor wash turning the plateau into chaos. "Move," Brooklyn shouted. Her voice carried over the roar. She dragged on the travois, Torres and another soldier hauling Davis between them. The others stumbled forward, their bodies pushed by wind, pulled by desperation. The helicopter's ramp slammed down. Hands reached out, pulling, dragging, lifting. One by one, the soldiers disappeared inside. Brooklyn shoved aboard, then Davis. Torres fought to climb, turned back once, eyes locking on hers. For the first time since she'd found him, tears cut through the grime on his face. "You did it, Hayes, you did it." She said nothing. She just nodded, her jaw tight, her chest burning. As the last soldier was hauled inside, Brooklyn grabbed the ramp, pulling herself up. The helicopter lurched, lifting into the storm. The plateau vanished below, swallowed by snow. Inside, the men clung to one another, shivering, alive. Alive because she had refused to accept anything less. Brooklyn sat against the wall, her body trembling, her face pale. She closed her eyes, listening to the engine's hum, feeling the weight of 6 lives pressed against her. Relief washed through her like fire and ice at once. But deeper than relief was something quieter, a question she didn't want to face yet. What now? Because when the storm cleared and the stories spread, she knew life would never be the same. Why was she the only one sitting in silence? The debriefing room was warm, too warm, after days of frozen air clawing at her lungs. The heat should have comforted her. It didn't. It pressed against her skin like judgment, like every eye fixed on her while she tried to shrink into her chair. The rescued soldiers sat along the wall, bandaged, wrapped in blankets, IV lines running into arms that had been gray with cold just a day before. They were alive because of her, and they wouldn't stop looking at her as if she were something more than flesh and blood. Brooklyn hated that look. Colonel Martinez paced the front of the room, reading the mission report aloud, her voice cutting through the hush. 6 soldiers located, stabilized under extreme conditions, extracted against all probability. 1 operator, acting alone, accomplished what 2 full search teams could not. Her words weren't praise, they were fact, delivered in the clipped tone of an officer cataloging the impossible. But every fact carried weight. Every sentence turned Brooklyn from invisible soldier to something else entirely. The colonel stopped, eyes lifting from the report. They landed on Brooklyn. "Sergeant Hayes, stand." Brooklyn rose slowly, her shoulders tight, her breath shallow. Martinez studied her like a puzzle. "How did you do it? That terrain should have buried you. The weather should have killed you. What training prepared you for this?" Brooklyn's lips parted, but words tangled in her throat. She thought of her father's hands, rough with frostbite scars, guiding hers over a compass. She thought of the nights spent alone at 14, sleeping in snow caves she dug herself, learning what silence sounded like when it pressed against your ears. Finally she managed. "Ma'am, I grew up in it, in Alaska. My father taught me how to listen to the land, how to survive." A ripple of quiet disbelief moved through the room. Not laughter, not mockery, just the unease of soldiers confronted with something outside doctrine, outside manuals and drills. Colonel Martinez didn't smile, but her eyes softened just slightly. You realize your methods aren't in any manual we teach. You improvised, you adapted, you succeeded. That matters. Brooklyn lowered her gaze. Ma'am, I just did what I knew how to do. Behind her, Tor's voice broke the silence. Stronger now, steady. With respect, Colonel, that's not what she did. She saved 6 lives, mine included. She didn't just do what she knew. She carried us when the rest of us couldn't walk. She refused to leave anyone behind, even when it meant risking herself. The words landed heavy in the room. No one argued. Brooklyn felt heat rise in her cheeks. She didn't want the weight of their gratitude. She wanted the quiet again, the snow, the storm, the simplicity of survival where actions spoke louder than stories. But stories were already spreading. That night, walking back across the base, soldiers she barely knew stopped to look at her. Some nodded in respect. Others whispered, their words carried on the cold air. That's her, the one who found Bravo, the one who went alone. Brooklyn kept her eyes on the ground, her hands buried in her pockets. She didn't feel like a savior. She felt hollow, drained. In her barracks, she lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling. The silence here was different, artificial, humming with generators and distant voices. Not like Alaska, not like the storm. She closed her eyes and remembered the faces of the men when she first found them, pale, dying, yet flickering back to life when they saw her. That memory weighed more than medals ever could. Days passed. The soldiers of Bravo healed. Reports climbed the chain of command. Whispers turned to official recognition. Major General himself arrived to review the mission file. He called Brooklyn into his office, a place lined with maps and battle reports, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fatigue. He studied her across the desk. Sergeant Hayes, I've read your file, ordinary by most accounts, quiet, reliable, nothing that suggested, he gestured vaguely as if the word itself was too large. This. Brooklyn sat still, her back straight. Sir, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just didn't want them to die. The general leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. That's exactly the point. You acted where others hesitated. You applied knowledge the army doesn't teach. You changed the outcome of an entire mission. Do you understand what that means? She shook her head slightly. No, sir, not really. He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. It means we need you, not just as a soldier, as something more. Your skills, your instincts, they can't stay hidden. We have to develop them, and we have to pass them on. Brooklyn swallowed, her throat dry. The thought of standing in front of others, teaching, exposing herself, that frightened her more than the storm. But the general's voice softened, almost kind. This isn't a request, Sergeant. It's an opportunity. You saved 6 lives because of what you knew. How many more could you save if others learned the same? She left the office with her chest tight, her mind tangled. Opportunity, responsibility, words that felt heavier than the mountain she had crossed. That night, Tors found her sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at the stars. His limp was worse in the cold, but he lowered himself beside her anyway. You know they're going to use your story, right? He said quietly. She didn't answer. They're going to make you an example, the quiet soldier who turned impossible into possible, and maybe that's not fair, but maybe it matters. Brooklyn finally turned to him, her pale eyes reflecting the faint starlight. I never wanted any of this. Tor's voice dropped. Neither did we. None of us asked to get stranded out there. None of us asked you to come find us, but you did, and now every one of us owes you more than words. She looked back at the sky. What if I can't live up to it? What if that was just one time? Tors shook his head. Hayes, people don't walk into death and bring 6 men back unless it's who they are. You'll live up to it because you already did. The words lingered with her long after he left. And so the quiet soldier from Alaska found herself at a crossroads. She had survived the storm, carried others through it, and emerged alive. But survival wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something larger, something she wasn't sure she wanted but couldn't walk away from. Because sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought in mountains or storms. They're fought in the silence afterward, when the world finally sees you and you can no longer hide. Why was she the one they were all waiting for? Brooklyn stood in front of a room full of soldiers, the kind of men and women who usually intimidated her with their confidence, their sharp laughter, their certainty. Now they sat silent, eyes fixed on her, waiting. She hated this. Her palms were damp, her pulse fluttered. She wanted to be anywhere but here. The wilderness didn't ask you to explain yourself, it asked only that you endure. But here, they wanted words, explanations, lessons. Major General's voice echoed in her head. How many more lives could you save if others learned what you know? Brooklyn swallowed hard and lifted her eyes. This isn't about textbooks, she said quietly. Her voice felt thin at first, fragile, but the room stayed silent, listening. It's about watching, listening. The land speaks always. Most people don't hear it because they're too busy looking for rules, but rules don't keep you alive. Awareness does. She picked up a stick of chalk, drew jagged lines across the board. Mountains, valleys, ravines. She explained how wind carved paths, how snow buried trails but also preserved them, how the tiniest broken branch could scream louder than footprints. At first the soldiers looked skeptical, but as she spoke, her hands moving with quiet confidence, something shifted. Their pens began to move. Their eyes leaned forward. And Brooklyn realized this wasn't about her. It was about them, about giving them the tools she had carried alone for too long. Still, when the session ended and the soldiers filed out, she sat alone, her body trembling with exhaustion. The storm out there in the mountains had nearly broken her body. This storm, the one of attention, expectation, responsibility, threatened to break her spirit. That night she lay awake in her bunk. The base was alive with distant noise, trucks moving, soldiers laughing, generators humming. But her mind returned to the silence of Alaska, the rhythm of snow against a cabin roof. Her father's calm voice teaching her to track caribou, to mend traps, to wait for hours without moving. She longed for that silence. But instead she woke each morning to new demands, another class to teach, another meeting with officers dissecting her methods, another soldier asking her, eyes wide, how did you know they'd be there? How did you find them? Sometimes she answered with details, patterns of tracks, wind, instinct sharpened by years. But more often she didn't answer at all, because the truth was harder. She didn't always know. She only trusted what she felt, and she refused to stop moving until she found what was lost. Weeks passed. She trained more soldiers. She walked them through drills in the mountains, forcing them to navigate blind, to read signs that weren't in manuals. She watched as some struggled, others surprised themselves, and a few began to glimpse what she meant by listening. But doubt gnawed at her. What if she was wrong? What if what worked for her couldn't be taught? What if she was nothing but a lucky story the army had decided to turn into legend? One evening, after a brutal training march, Tors found her sitting alone again, boots off, rubbing at blistered feet. His limp was worse than before, but his eyes held the same steadiness she remembered from the shelter. "You're killing yourself with this pace," he said. Brooklyn shook her head. "I can't let them think it was just chance. I can't let them down." Tors lowered himself onto the bench beside her, grimacing at his leg. "Hayes, listen to me. You already proved it wasn't chance. We're sitting here breathing because of you. That's fact. And now, you don't have to prove anything. You just have to pass it on." She looked at him, her pale eyes weary. "What if I can't? What if it's just me?" Tors chuckled softly. "Then you show them what you do and they take pieces of it. Maybe none of them become you, but maybe they don't need to. Maybe they just need enough to survive the next storm." His words settled into her like embers, slow and steady. The following week, during another training exercise, one of the younger soldiers, Private Monroe, got separated from the group in thick fog. Panic spread quickly among the trainees, but Brooklyn stayed calm. She read the terrain, followed the subtle shift of crushed grass, the faint echo of footsteps. She found him crouched behind a rock, trembling, certain he was lost forever. When she led him back to the others, his face burned with shame. "I failed. I couldn't even." Brooklyn cut him off, her tone softer than her usual clipped commands. "You didn't fail, you learned. The land tested you. It always will. Next time you'll be ready." For the first time she saw her father's voice in her own, quiet, patient, steady. And for the first time, she realized maybe she could do this. But as Brooklyn grew into her new role, whispers reached her ears, whispers of commanders eyeing her for more than teaching. Special operations units, missions beyond training, the kind of assignments where silence wasn't just survival, it was the mission itself. At night she lay awake with the weight of it. Did she want that path? Did she want to become more visible, more used, more tested? Or was she already losing the part of herself that had made her strong, the quiet girl who survived by listening, not by commanding? Her heart pulled in two directions, one toward duty, the other toward the silence she missed so deeply. And she knew the day was coming when she would have to choose. Why did the jungle feel louder than war? Brooklyn crouched in the thick undergrowth, sweat dripping from her jawline, her pale blue eyes scanning a world that seemed alive in every direction. The storm in Afghanistan had howled its fury, but the jungle whispered and shrieked with 1,000 voices at once, birds crying warnings, insects humming, leaves rustling like restless ghosts. She preferred snow. Snow told the truth. Snow left tracks that spoke plainly, winds that carried secrets you could read if you listened. But here, every leaf seemed to lie. Every sound overlapped until it was impossible to know what was natural and what wasn't. The helicopter wreckage was 3 kilometers east. Coalition personnel had gone down 2 days earlier. The jungle had swallowed them whole. Local forces had already written them off as lost. But command had sent her, Brooklyn Hayes, the quiet Alaska girl turned reluctant legend. She hated the word legend. Sweat stung her eyes. The air pressed heavy, humid, suffocating. Each breath felt like drinking water instead of breathing it. Her uniform clung, boots sinking in mud that sucked like quicksand. Yet her steps were measured, deliberate. She adapted as she always did. The small team sent with her followed close, watching every move. They weren't there to lead, they were there to learn, to witness how she operated. She felt their eyes the way she'd once felt wolves watching from the tree line back home. Silent, expectant. One of them whispered, "How do you even start in this?" Brooklyn didn't turn, her voice was low, even. "The same way anywhere, stop fighting it, listen." They thought listening meant waiting. But for Brooklyn, listening meant reading. The way vines bent, the way soil shifted, the faint marks on bark where metal scraped against it. 2 hours into the search, she found the first sign. A torn strap caught on a branch, frayed and damp. She lifted it gently, her chest tightening. "They made it out of the wreck," she said quietly. "They're moving." Hope sparked in the others. But hope was dangerous. She'd seen how it could blind people, make them rush, make them careless. She steadied her own breathing. This was no mountain storm, but it was just as merciless. They pressed deeper. The canopy swallowed light, leaving the world dim and green. Mosquitoes swarmed. Roots clawed at their ankles. Every step was slow, deliberate. And yet something felt wrong. Brooklyn paused, kneeling. The mud carried footprints, 2, maybe 3 people, deeper than they should be, slowed, heavy, injured. She traced the edges with her fingers, reading the weight. But alongside them, other tracks, narrower, bare feet, many of them. Her pulse quickened. They're not alone. Enemy forces. The jungle wasn't just swallowing survivors, it was hunting them. The soldiers behind her stiffened. One muttered a curse under his breath. Brooklyn rose, eyes scanning the shadows. She remembered her father's words. Predators don't always attack. Sometimes they follow, waiting until you're weak enough. The danger isn't always the roar. Sometimes it's the silence. She motioned for the team to stay close. Her steps grew slower, softer, each movement a whisper against the jungle floor. After another kilometer, they found them. Two coalition survivors collapsed near a fallen tree. One man barely conscious, his leg wrapped in bloody cloth. The other tried to rise at their approach, his eyes wide with terror, rifle trembling in his hands until he recognized the uniforms. "Help, please," his voice cracked, ragged from thirst and fear. Brooklyn knelt, pulling water from her pack, pressing it to cracked lips. The man drank desperately. The injured one groaned, his fever burning. Infection was already spreading. But Brooklyn's eyes weren't just on them. They scanned the trees, the shadows. The jungle was too quiet now. She turned to her team, voice sharp but soft enough not to carry. "We're not alone. Move fast. Carry them if you have to." As they lifted the survivors, a branch cracked in the distance. Then another, the kind of sound no bird made. Brooklyn's heart thudded, but her face stayed calm. Panic would kill faster than bullets. "Stay low, stay quiet," she whispered. They moved through the jungle, each step deliberate, every breath shallow. Behind them, faint shapes shifted in the green gloom. Brooklyn didn't need to see their faces. She could feel the pursuit. 1 kilometer from the extraction point, the first shot cracked through the air. Bark splintered inches from her head. The jungle erupted in chaos, shouts, gunfire, the sharp sting of adrenaline flooding veins. Her team scattered for cover, dragging the survivors with them. Brooklyn pressed against a tree, her breath steady despite the roar in her ears. She had been here before, not here exactly, but in the same space between life and death, where stillness mattered more than fear. She aimed carefully, not wasting bullets. One shot, a figure crumpled. Another. The jungle screamed back with return fire. But this wasn't her fight. The mission wasn't to kill. The mission was to carry life out of death's grip. "Move," she shouted, her voice cut through the chaos. "Now." They surged forward, gunfire snapping at their heels. Brooklyn covered the rear, her movements sharp, precise, refusing to let fear dictate her aim. When they finally broke into the clearing, the helicopter was already descending, rotor wash flattening grass, scattering leaves like confetti. Her team shoved the survivors aboard, one man groaning, the other clinging to consciousness. Soldiers scrambled in after them. Brooklyn lingered at the edge, her rifle still raised, eyes on the tree line where shadows flickered. For a moment, she thought of staying behind, drawing the enemy away, letting herself vanish into the jungle the way she once vanished into storms. But then she felt Tor's words in her chest. "You'll live up to it because you already did." She pulled herself aboard, and the helicopter lifted, bullets snapping against its frame until the jungle fell away beneath them. Inside, the rescued survivors clutched her hands weakly, eyes wide with gratitude that said more than words. Her team stared at her too, their faces lit with the realization that what they'd heard about her was true. Brooklyn sat back against the wall, her body trembling with exhaustion, sweat mingling with dirt, her breath ragged. She closed her eyes, letting the engines hum steady her. Another storm survived, another life carried back from the edge. But as the jungle shrank beneath her, she wondered how many storms one person could endure before the silence she longed for slipped out of reach forever. Why did they keep looking at her, as if she had all the answers? Brooklyn sat at the edge of the training field, the air thick with dust and sweat. 50 soldiers stood before her in tight formation, waiting for instructions. Not recruits, not beginners. Men and women already hardened by combat, pulled from different branches because someone decided they needed her lessons. She still didn't believe it. Her father had taught her in silence, beside rivers and under skis that stretched endlessly. Now she was expected to teach in front of crowds, her words amplified by authority she had never asked for. She pushed to her feet slowly, adjusting the brim of her cap, her voice low but steady. What I teach you isn't about strength. It isn't about firepower. It's about paying attention. The land talks. People talk without words. Survival isn't muscle, it's awareness. Some faces looked skeptical, some hungry, some tired. Brooklyn bent down, picking up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through her fingers. You want to know how I found Bravo Team? I didn't follow orders. I didn't follow manuals. I followed signs. Signs the land left because it always does. Out there, the world writes the truth if you know how to read it. She sent them into the hills with minimal gear, watching as they scattered in pairs. She knew most would get lost. She knew fear would creep in when the sun dropped and shadows stretched. That was the point. Real survival wasn't built in classrooms. It was carved by desperation and choice. When they stumbled back hours later, dirty, frustrated, hungry, she didn't scold them. She simply asked, "What did you see? What did you miss? What signs did you ignore?" Some hung their heads. Some spoke about trails they noticed too late. Others admitted panic made them blind. Brooklyn nodded. "Good, that's the lesson. You learn by failing, you survive by remembering. Next time you'll see more. Next time you'll live." She dismissed them, but even as they filed out, she felt the weight of their eyes. The quiet Alaska girl who had once been invisible was now the center of something larger than herself. And she wasn't sure she wanted it. That night she walked alone along the edge of the base, where the desert stretched into silence. She looked at the stars, foreign, but endless like the ones back home. She breathed deep, wishing the noise of duty could vanish into the kind of quiet that once saved her. But there was no going back. Within months her training program expanded. She was promoted sergeant, then staff sergeant. More soldiers came through her courses. Some thrived, some broke, but all left changed. Commanders began to whisper about a new doctrine, wilderness-adapted operations, survival-first missions, techniques that bore her fingerprints. And then came the order that shifted everything. She would lead her own team. The idea made her chest tighten. She was a tracker, a survivor, not a leader. She had carried men through storms, yes, but she had never asked anyone to follow her into the unknown. Yet when command introduced her to the squad assigned to her, she saw the trust already in their eyes. Trust not in rank but in reputation. They knew her story. They wanted to learn from it. Her first mission as a leader came sooner than expected. Intelligence suggested hostages deep in mountainous terrain eerily familiar to her first rescue. The risk was high, the weather brutal, the enemy entrenched. Her team waited for orders, the cold wind biting their faces, their weapons heavy in their hands. Brooklyn felt their gaze again, waiting for her voice, her decision. She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of it. She remembered Tors, broken and bleeding, trusting her without words. She remembered Davis, shivering, whispering he couldn't go on. She remembered her father telling her, "Real strength isn't loud, it's quiet, it's steady, it just keeps going." Brooklyn lifted her chin. "We move at night. We use the storm, not fight it. Stay low, stay silent, follow the signs. I'll read the ground, you keep your eyes on me." The words came calm, simple, and the men nodded, not because her rank demanded it, but because her presence steadied them. That night, as snow lashed across the mountains, Brooklyn led them forward. She traced hidden paths, guided them through white blindness, avoided enemy patrols not by luck but by instinct sharpened to a razor's edge. When they finally reached the hostages, shivering, terrified but alive, her team looked at her not with awe but with something deeper: trust. They exfiltrated under cover of storm, and not a single soldier under her command was lost. Back at base, commanders called it brilliant, textbook-defying, another miracle. But alone in her barracks, Brooklyn stared at her hands, trembling with fatigue, her body aching. She whispered into the silence, I never wanted to lead. And yet she knew she would do it again. Not for glory, not for medals, for the faces she couldn't forget, the ones who had once looked at her and believed they were already dead until she refused to let them be. Leadership, she realized, wasn't about wanting it. It was about carrying it when no one else could. But the cost was mounting. Every mission, every class, every soldier who looked at her with that unspoken question, "Can you save me?" two etched deeper lines into her soul. Brooklyn Hayes had become more than the quiet Alaska girl. She had become something the Army itself was beginning to shape into doctrine, a symbol, a weapon, a savior. And symbols rarely got to rest. Why do some stories refuse to fade, even when the person inside them never asked to be remembered? Years later, Brooklyn Hayes sat at the edge of another mountain, the air thin and sharp, snow drifting in waves across the ridge. She wasn't on mission. She wasn't leading men through storms or jungles. She was simply sitting, breathing, listening. Listening was what had always saved her. Behind her, soldiers moved through an exercise, young, eager, loud. They carried packs too heavy, stumbled in boots too new, argued about routes that meant little to the mountain itself. They didn't know she was watching. That was how she liked it. One of them slipped, sliding halfway down the slope before catching himself, panic flashing across his face. His teammates scrambled, shouting, unsure how to help. Brooklyn rose slowly, walked toward them with the same quiet steps she had used since childhood. She knelt, spoke calmly, guided the young soldier back to his feet. She didn't scold. She didn't lecture. She only said, "The land always wins, but it doesn't have to kill you. Respect it and it will teach you." The boy nodded, his breath still ragged, eyes wide as if she had handed him something more than advice. And in a way she had. Brooklyn walked back to her perch, watching as they continued. The Army called it training. She called it something else, teaching them how to stay human when the world tried to strip it away. Her legend had grown larger than she ever wanted. Commanders told her story in classrooms. Soldiers whispered it in barracks. The day she carried 6 men out of a storm had become almost myth. Some called it miracle. Others called it luck. But Brooklyn knew better. It wasn't miracle. It wasn't luck. It was simply listening, listening to the land, to fear, to silence, listening long enough to act when others froze. She hated the medals. She hated the speeches. But she accepted them quietly because each ribbon, each citation meant someone remembered what mattered most, that 6 men came home alive. Still at night, when the base grew quiet and the desert or mountains or jungle stretched dark beyond the fences, she wondered if the cost was worth it. Not the cost of survival, she would pay that every time, but the cost of being seen. The quiet Alaska girl had once belonged only to rivers, to snow, to silence. Now she belonged to a story told by others, a story that no longer felt entirely hers. And yet, when Torres visited, limping heavier with age, his voice carried the same gratitude it always had. "Hayes, you know we tell our kids about you, right? How you refused to quit, how you refused to leave anyone behind. My son wants to join the Army because of you." Brooklyn had smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Tell him not to be like me. Tell him to be stronger." Torres only laughed softly. "You don't get it, do you? Strength isn't loud, it isn't medals. It's what you did out there when nobody else believed it could be done. That's the strength we tell them about." She didn't argue, she never did. But later, alone, she whispered to the wind, "I just listened." Time passed. Missions came and went, some harder than mountains, some quieter than storms. She carried soldiers through jungles, deserts, snow. She taught hundreds more how to see what others ignored. Her name became attached to doctrine, to schools, to programs. But Brooklyn herself never changed. She stayed quiet. She stayed still. She stayed the girl from Alaska who could vanish into wilderness and return carrying what was lost. And when people asked her how she did it, how she survived storms, jungles, enemies, silence, she gave the same answer every time. I paid attention. The truth was simple. The lesson was simple. And yet, that simplicity saved lives in places where complexity killed. One evening, as the sun bled red over the horizon, Brooklyn sat alone, watching shadows stretch across the land. She thought of her father, his voice steady, his lessons carved into her bones. She thought of Bravo team's faces when she first stepped into their shelter, half dead but clinging to hope. She thought of every soldier who had ever whispered thank you, every set of eyes that had carried belief back into the world because she refused to stop moving. And she understood something she hadn't before. Her story was never about heroics. It was never about glory. It was never about being remembered. It was about dignity, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that doesn't ask for medals, the kind that doesn't speak. It simply acts. And that was enough.